All right. Welcome to the large intestine. The large intestine begins at the ileocecal valve, uh, which introduces us into the cecum, and then we begin the colon, which consists of three parts, and then we finally end in the rectum. So let's go ahead and draw this out. So we have our, let's go ahead and start at the stomach actually for a review. Stomach into small intestine. Small intestine starts with the duodenum. Then I'm just going to kind of draw this poorly, but then the jejunum, and then the ileum. And then on the right hand side, we'll have the ileocecal valve. So I'll just draw it like this. I always forget if it's one L or if it's two L's. One L, ileocecal valve. Okay, this will allow us entry into the beginning of the large intestine, which is the cecum. So the cecum is a large pouch. The cecum is really important because it'll be where we have a large majority of the gut microbiome that will be sampling the environment of the feces before it goes through the large intestine. The cecum will also start absorbing the water, and the rest of the water will be absorbed by large intestine. So the cecum is kind of like a holding storage unit before the rest of it travels through the large intestine. So then after the cecum, we have three parts. We have one part that goes up, we have one part that goes across, and we have one part that comes down. So those are the three parts of our colon. So this is going to be the ascending colon. This cuts across, so we call that the transverse colon. And then we have a part that goes down, so we call that the descending colon. And then from the descending colon, then we kind of tuck into the pelvis. We begin first with the sigmoid colon. It's called sigmoid because it's shaped sigmoidally, sigmoid colon. Then we have a straight shot. So rectus means straight shot, so that's the rectum. And then we finally end with the anus. Okay. So the cecum. This is where we also begin compaction. So first we did a lot of peristalsis through here. We didn't do quite a lot of segmentation. We usually save that for the large intestine. So we begin compacting in the cecum so that we can start segmentation through the large intestine. We also have something called the vermiform appendix, which is going to be attached at the cecum. I'm going to zoom in here. Vermiform appendix. Why vermiform? So vermiform means worm-like, and it really does look wormy. Everyone's has a different shape to them, different smells to them. Usually when they explode, they smell terribly in surgery, so hopefully that doesn't happen to you. And then appendix, we have many appendices in the body, so you need to be specific and call it the vermiform appendix. If you have an appendicitis, that's where this ruptures and bursts. Science always argues about whether or not there's any functionality to the appendix. It's still not, we're not cohesive in explaining what the function is of the appendix. If anyone does tell you that there's a function to an appendix, they usually say that it has immune properties to it, so it's always sampling what's going on in the cecum, and if it realizes that anything's wrong there, then it'll trigger the immune system to come in and help. Some people argue that that's not really, we don't use that anymore. It's a vestigial trait, as in we kind of evolved out of it. We don't need it anymore. But it's not a cohesive explanation. There was one point in surgery where people were, like if you went in for surgery or you had any abdominal pain whatsoever, and they were already in there anyway, they would usually just take out your appendix anyway to avoid you having an appendicitis. This practice was stopped, I believe, in the 80s and early 90s because it was useless and they weren't really sure, like, oh, well, we think the appendix doesn't have a function, but what if it does? Let's just leave it in there and study it more before we keep taking out the appendix of everyone. So if you ever get the chance to dissect a cadaver and you're looking for the appendix, future cadavers might not even have one, depending on how old they were and if they ever went through that period whenever surgeons were just taking out appendices willy-nilly. So anyway, fun facts for 500. Okay, so the colon. Let's go back to the ascending, transverse, and descending colon. We have some other structures we need to identify. So let me go ahead and zoom in on the descending colon since I have some space over here. We have two structures that we need to talk about. First, we have something called a haustra or haustrum for singular, and those are like these pouches. And if you've looked at if you've ever looked at the large intestine, you'll notice that it's way more pouchy than the small intestine. The small intestine just looks like a big muscular tube, while the large intestine looks like a bunch of pouches put together. So each of these pouches is called a haustrum. If you talk about them all together collectively, then it's haustra. Attaching each of these is a long muscular band, which goes all the way across. So I could draw it across the transverse and across the ascending colon. And we call that the tenia coli. This is helpful in peristalsis and segmental contractions. Then also we have some packets of, let's see, what color should we draw packets of fat in? Let's go with a brown. We have these little random patches of fat, and they literally just kind of look like, you know how when you're eating a steak and the fat hasn't been trimmed all the way around, and there's just like little bands of like fat goblets that are still attached to the meat. That's exactly what these look like. They're important because they help isolate where fatty tissue is that's separate from the omentum. But they can be really dangerous because sometimes these outpocketings can actually become diverticulum or diverticuli, which is an outpocketing of the intestinal wall. This is usually common whenever you're eating things like corn, which are really difficult for the digestive system to break apart. And so if you're eating large quantities of different types of, or certain foods like this, they can actually tear through the wall and then end up in these outpocketings, and then they kind of get lost in the GI system. But then your GI system doesn't know how to register what it is, so it just gets inflamed and painful. And then a surgeon has to get in there and feel around through your intestines before they find it. So they're useful, but you don't want too many of these, is the whole point. So anyway, we call these omental appendices. So they're not part of the omentum, but they're like additions of the omentum that weren't already attached to the omentum. They're attached to the large intestine. Then we have names for each of the bends that we have of the large intestine. So we have the right colic flexure, then we have the left colic flexure, and since this is the right side of the body, this is going to be our right colic flexure, flexure just meaning turn, and then here we're going to have our left colic flexure. Nothing too special there with naming. All right, then at the rectum, the straight part of the large intestine, we end at the anal canal. We have lots of small folds here. We call those anal columns. Anus means exit, to exit, so that's why that is named there. And at the anus, we have the anal sphincter. So we have two different pieces of muscle here, so I'm going to just zoom in here on the next slide. So let's see here. So let's draw the rectum like this, and we have two bands of tissue, and let's call this whole portion the anus. So we have two bands of sphincter muscles down here. One is going to be internal. Wow, I'm really struggling with spelling today, I'm sorry. Internal and external anal sphincters. Okay, so they're sphincters, so they're bands of muscle. These are important because they will coordinate whether or not we voluntarily or voluntarily contract and release any of the feces that have been stored in the large intestine. So the external one is under voluntary control, the internal one is not under voluntary control. This makes sense because as feces, let's draw that brown, as feces build up in the rectum, they will push on the internal anal sphincter first. And pushing on the internal anal sphincter first will be really important as part of the defecation reflex, but we want it to push on the sphincter that doesn't have any conscious control of, because then that will alert our consciousness, like, oh, I have to poop, and then we can coordinate our external anal sphincter to actually release the opening of the anus to actually defecate. We'll talk about that here in an upcoming slide. So the histology, we have a lot thinner walls in the large intestine. The whole purpose of the large intestine is absorb any leftover water. We like holding on to water. Water is important. We have lots of large lymph nodes in this area, so again, sampling the environment, making sure that it's all right before it exits. We don't have a lot of villi. It's pretty flat under the microscope. We don't have any goblet cells here, and we don't have a lot of glands. All right, so absorption. So we're focused on water absorption. We absorb some bile salts, some vitamins, some organic wastes, urobilin and serocobilin, which we talked about whenever we were talking about the breakdown of the heme molecules and the the reconstruction of red blood cells. Whenever serocobilins are exposed to O2, they turn brown or yellow-brown, so this is why you'll have different colorings in your feces, again, depending on your diet as well, too, so that'll also have an effect on whether or not it's a little bit more brown than usual, a little bit more orange, or a little bit more yellow. You have the microbiome in the large intestine, so you've got lots of good gut bacteria living here. Like I said, a majority of that is going to be in your cecum. Some of these bacteria will actually help make the vitamins that you need in order to live on a day-to-day basis. 3 of those include vitamin K, biotin, and vitamin B5. These are not the only ways that you can get it, but this is why diet is really important too. Some diets will be more prone to these bacteria being able to make these vitamins. Some of them won't be able to make those vitamins, and if you're ever, I mean, these are minor vitamins. They're not some of the most vital vitamins, but you might be recommended a certain diet by a physician or by a dietitian if you are deficient in other areas. After the bacteria in the large intestine actually digest the food stuffs, they might also make additional byproducts like ammonia, indiol, skatol, and hydrogen sulfide, and all of this collectively is what makes flatus, or flatulence, which is farts or gas. So this is why, depending again on what you're eating, and depending on what's left over by the time it gets to the large intestine, those gut microbiomes are going to eat, or the gut microbiome, the gut bacteria, as they're eating the leftover food stuff, depending on what that food stuff is, will depend on what bacteria and if the bacteria can even break it apart. And part of the byproducts of it breaking apart is gas. And so this is why your farts might smell a little smellier after certain meals, but not so smelly after other meals. It's really dependent on those bacteria breaking apart those foodstuffs. And then that gas just gets lodged in between the segmentation of all of these feces. All right, so motility of the large intestine. Slow, typically. We do a little bit of peristalsis, but like I said, we mainly do segmentation. Any distension of the large intestine will activate intestinal nerve plexuses to start moving things along and to initiate more movement of the large intestine. We don't like things getting stuck. We like moving things along the GI tract. Once we finally get enough feces to the end of the GI tract at the anus, then we initiate the defecation reflex. So like I said, we have 2 sphincters that we need to talk about, and we have 2 reflexes that we need to talk about. So both of them are going to target the internal anal sphincter first. So we have the intrinsic myenteric defecation reflex, and then we have the parasympathetic defecation reflex. So the intrinsic one is going to happen first. It's intrinsic because it's happening on the inside of the internal anal sphincter. It's a short reflex, so once you start building up more feces in this area, it'll activate the short reflex so that the sphincter's like, okay, I guess I need to hold on to this a little bit better. Then that short reflex turns into the parasympathetic defecation reflex after we get enough movement. That's a long reflex, so that's going all the way up to central nervous system and telling it like, hey, we've got a lot of storage up here. What do you want us to do about it? Then the anal sphincter starts to relax. It relaxes the most. And then the feces will start depositing against the external anal sphincter, and hopefully by that time you've already talked to the brain and said, hey, we've got stuff going on down here. Maybe you should find a bathroom. And then you go and you find the bathroom, and then you release the external sphincter via sympathetic innervation. This is, not sympathetic innervation, but, sympathetic innervation. But these are skeletal muscle fibers, so you actually have control over these. and then you defecate. Fun. Okay. Elimination. So defecation is the process of actually the process of building up feces and then releasing it. The process of releasing it we call elimination. This means that you have to tell the pelvic floor muscles to also relax. That's done through pudendal nerve. And then that will tell the sphincter muscles to relax entirely for the entire pelvis. Hopefully you don't. This is really important because if you don't have an organized system, or you have really weak tissues or not a really strong supportive system of muscles and connective fibers in the pelvis, then you could get something called a prolapse, which is where and let me draw a pelvis somewhere here. So let's say that typically, and let's say this is my pelvis, this is my pubic bone. This is a terrible picture. This is my pubic bone, and here is the like the obturator foramen is down here. You all can imagine. I mean, this is turning into a terrible picture, but obviously the anus is open to the external environment. If you don't have the supportive structure of all of the pelvic floor muscles down here, you can have something called a prolapse. And this can happen for other organs as well, like the uterus. You can have a uterine prolapse, you can have an anal prolapse. And this is where the anus and or part of the rectum might actually leave the pelvic floor and descend and actually exit through that opening. This can be really damaging for the surrounding muscles. It can be really difficult to repair surgically. It can cause a lot of added pressure to any of the other organs and structures that might be in the pelvis, especially if you're female, you're carrying the uterus down there as well. It allows for easier modes of infection to travel through, blood vessels to pop. I mean, it's dangerous and it really needs to be taken care of. There's usually 4 stages of prolapse, with 4th being the worst, one being it's slightly protruding out. Anal prolapse can be avoided by practicing safe sex, by using condom usage, and by using lubrication. Anal sex is fine as long as you're protecting yourself. There's a lot of blood vessels. There is a lot of mucous membranes here. This structure is already open to the external environment anyway, and it already has a lot of gut bacteria. But it doesn't need to be exposed to more, so you really need to protect yourself if you're practicing that, so that you don't tear any of these muscles, because they're relatively thin. They're not, like I mentioned up here, we only have the tenia coli really holding this all together, and a little bit of the muscularis layer of the entire GI tract, but other than that, you don't have a lot going on, and unless you're practicing like regular pelvic floor muscle exercises, you need to be really, really careful about taking care of this delicate tissue. You could have a lot of micro tears that can lead to other infections. So just be careful. Lots of lubrication and condom usage is highly recommended. We'll also talk about uterine prolapse whenever we get to the female reproductive system, but same thing applies there, except there we're talking more about avoiding having multiple pregnancies back to back, having at least enough time in between each to re-strengthen the pelvic floor, to also avoid any types of serious aggressive sex, avoiding not using any lubrication. Also, carrying heavy loads after pregnancy can be really prone to uterine prolapse. And same problem applies there too, because if you have the uterus exposed to the external environment when it's normally supposed to be inside the pelvis, then you could be exposed to all sorts of bacterial and viral infections. Well, bacterial infections, but infections, not good news. Okay, all right. Enough about anal prolapse. Last but not least, sometimes, and this is just fun facts for 500, but sometimes if the parasympathetic nervous system defecation reflex is greater than the intrinsic reflex, the force may be large enough to force a defecation. So, what does that mean? That means you pooped your pants without knowing that you pooped your pants, or at least you weren't anticipating that you were going to poop your pants. So, for instance, you might have, and what we're talking about here is the parasympathetic defecation reflex. gets activated first. So if your brain gets told, hey, we need to relax these muscles down here fast and quick, but you haven't had enough time to possibly stop it with the internal anal sphincters, the external sphincters might not even know that they should have been closed in the first place. So feces might actually just descend without you knowing it. This is where this is typically problematic in folks that are older, or they might have compromised nervous systems for whatever reason, or maybe their parasympathetics, or their autonomics in the brainstem, or any of those pathways that they have to pass through in order to finally get to the cerebral cortex before you know what's going on, they might be disrupted. So it's not appropriate to make fun of anyone who might have this case, because you might see a lot of patients that might have this, and it'll be they genuinely don't even mean to do it. It's not that they're stupid. It's not that they're not paying attention or that they weren't potty trained at any point. It could just be a complete loss of nervous control that they don't even know is happening. They're not even consciously perceiving what's going on, because they've never had a chance to have the parasympathetics talk to the external anal sphincters. All right, that's it for the large intestine.